Well, you've made it to part 3 of this evangelism training. I'm so glad that you're here. What we're talking about today is one of my favorite things because there's no pressure with this one. There's very little risk to this. It's something you already know how to do. It's something that God wants us to all improve upon and get better. But the very first step in sharing our faith with the people in our lives is by listening and getting to know their story. You see, influence, it always begins by listening. And part of what happens when we listen to someone is we are opening up ourselves to be influenced by the person that we're listening to. And so oftentimes we have everything in our neat little tidy boxes and everything, and then when we hear someone's story, quite often it changes the way that we see things or hear things. And when people see that we've listened and they've influenced us, they are more open to being influenced by us. And so what we're talking about today, it's not only true in our own experience, but this is something we see Jesus doing constantly. Did you know Jesus was asked more than 300 questions in the gospel accounts that we have, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? 300 times Jesus was asked a question. Do you know how many times he actually answered the question that he was asked? 3 times. Now, that's a direct answer 3 times. There's probably half a dozen, a little bit more maybe, where he kind of indirectly answered. But Jesus, his number one go-to was he would reply with a question, and then he would listen. And so this is something that we're going to learn about today. The first thing in getting to know someone's story, the first step of sharing the gospel with someone is getting to know their story. Why should we take time to get to know their story before we tell them about his story? Well, here's a few reasons. Number 1, Jesus listened to people's story. He listened to their story. We follow Jesus, so let's follow him the way that he did things. Jesus, he listened to people's story. He dined with sinners. Religious people would say, you shouldn't be hanging around that person, let alone eating a meal with them. And Jesus was like, oh, he didn't care. He listened to people's stories. He laughed with them. He likely cried with them. But we see Jesus doing this consistently. The second reason that we should take time to get to know their story before we tell them about Jesus' story is, number 2, their story is going to shape and influence how they interpret us. Some people, like my friend Mike, had all kinds of baggage about words like church or Christian. And so until Mike got to know me for who I was, if I would have come out with those words up front, it totally would have shaped the way that he interpreted everything that I said. And so listening to a person's story, getting to know their story is hugely important because their story is going to shape and influence how they interpret what we say. Number 3, their story will determine how we introduce his story. You see, there's no one-size-fits-all approach that we should expect to work. We need to know their story so that the Holy Spirit will get insight on what approach we should use that is customized to that person's story. The fourth reason we need to listen to their story first is their story, number 4 here, their story can open them up to hear another story. When people have their story listened to, they're quite frequently more interested in maybe hearing your story or hearing someone else's story. Here's the 5th reason. The way to someone's heart is through their story. The way to someone's heart is through their story. I've heard news reports in the last couple years with some of the racial unrest that has been becoming more and more. People were just more aware of these things. They've been there forever, and a lot of us just never saw it. And I've been hearing stories of black people and white people and Asian people intentionally sitting down with meals with each other just to hear each other's stories. And all of a sudden, people's nice little tidy boxes of politics and how they see things, as they hear someone else's story, they start going, man, it's not quite as simple as maybe I had out in my mind. And so the way to someone's heart is through hearing their story. Number 6, the way to become part of their story is to listen to it. And so getting to know their story, it's learning how to carry on conversations with people that allow the two of you to interact and for you to hear their story. And the art of being a good conversationalist is being a good listener and asking good questions. And so here's a few things about being a good listener. There's an art to being a good listener. Number one, it's being good at asking questions. In order to be a good listener, we need to become good at asking questions. Number two, there's an art to being a good listener. It's about listening to what people are saying and then feeding it back to them. When you're sharing something, not just the facts, but kind of how you felt about the facts. Most stories involve some form of emotion. I was annoyed, I was afraid, I was so happy when it happened. When that person has that story kind of repeated back, oh, so you felt like this when that happened, they're thinking like, you get me. There's a connection there, right? And so being a good listener, it's about saying and feeding back to them what they just said. Number three, it's taking their words and their emotions and telling them what we've heard by blending the words and emotions together. I think I just kind of said that in my previous point. So there it is again. Number four, it's learning to listen with our eyes, also with our ears and our hearts. Being a good listener, it's not just about the words. It's about, you can read their body language. That colors so much of what they say. And when you listen with your heart and you empathize and you go, wow, what would I have done if I was in those shoes? Being a good listener, it's about all of those things. Ears, eyes, and hearts. And number five, it's focusing on them, not on us. This takes practice because you and I do the same thing. When people are talking, they'll say something that triggers, I got a story. Okay, as soon as they're done talking, I'm going to tell them my story. Okay, are they done? Sounds like they're wrapping up. They're getting there soon. Okay, I'm not really listening to anything you say. And then you start telling your story, right? And so we need to stop it. We need to learn to focus on them and not be thinking about what we're going to say next. Here's a few reasons why questions are so good in getting to know someone else's story. Number one, it makes people think. I could be in the middle of telling a story, and then halfway through my story, before I've even resolved the story, I could just look at you and ask you a question. It stops you in your tracks, and you think about the question I just asked you. Even though we were going this way, a question, it stops people in their tracks, and it makes them actually think about the question that was asked. And sometimes people have never thought about these things before. And there's all kinds of space to explore there with a person when you ask a good question. Number two, asking questions, it tells them that you're interested in them. Number three, it tells them that you're listening, especially when, because you were listening, you ask a follow-up question. That's often where the best conversations come from. It comes from a follow-up question. I heard you say this, and then you're curious, so you just ask a follow-up question, and that tells them that you're listening. Number four, it allows them to investigate. Many times, we just run on our assumptions and we run on autopilot. We don't spend a lot of time being curious about something and investigating it. But that's how learning happens, is when we've got that curiosity. And so asking good questions allows them to investigate things they've probably never investigated before. Number five, it allows them to go places within themselves which they might not otherwise go to. And I think this is one of the biggest assumptions you and I make about people, is that haven't people thought about like the purpose to their life and the significance and all the different kinds of questions that we might ask? We're like, what do you mean you haven't thought of that? In many cases, the answer is no. They've been too busy trying to figure out, what they're going to make for supper when they get home and trying to keep up with their schedules. Number six, asking good questions. It allows them to think out loud. And sometimes thinking out loud, it gives you all kinds of follow-up questions to ask when people are verbally processing. And here's a few ways. Now let's pivot to this. Ways to let people know that you know them, because this is really important. If we don't practice the things listed in this little section here, it's possible people will think we're good conversationalists, but they might not get the hint that we really do know them. So here's a few ways to let people know that you know them. Number one, know their names. That's the first thing, know their names. And the way to remember someone's name when you meet someone, because you probably forget within a few seconds, and then you're like, oh, I feel so guilty. And you know what you often do when you forget someone's name? You'll avoid them because you're embarrassed, and you don't want to feel that embarrassment, right? And so learning their names, it gives you a confidence in speaking with them. And the way you remember their name is you say it about 3 or 4 times out loud as you're talking to them. Oh, hi, Jennifer. Oh, it's nice to meet you, Jennifer. Jennifer, tell me, how long have you worked here? Or Jennifer, tell me about yourself. You know, whatever the deal is. You say their name out loud a few times, and your brain has a much easier time latching on to what their name is. Here's the next thing. Know their birth dates. Write it down in your phone. You are going to forget. So, you know, don't ask them their birth date and then be like, hold on a second, and put it in your phone. That's creepy. But I do this all the time. I will remember their birth date, and sometime in the conversation or when we're done, I'll write it down. I'll put it in my calendar, and so it'll remind me. That lets them know that you know them. The next thing, notice when they're absent. If they weren't at work for a day or two, I mean, you might be thinking, I might be nosy. I don't want to make them think I'm stalking them or whatever the excuse is. But when you notice that they weren't there, they go like, oh, hey, it's nice to know that I was missed, right? Here's another thing. Find common interests. Find common interests with them. Find out what are they watching on Netflix these days, or if they're not into that, you know, what do they do with their free time? What do they enjoy? That'll let them know that you know them when you know those things. Also, give them individual attention. Sometimes you have some coworkers, the only time that you ever interact with them is in the standing meeting conversations with a whole group of people. Give them individual time. It could be in the parking lot before you're getting in your car, or it could be any number of ways. Buy them lunch one day just to hang out. The next way to let them know that you know them is meet their friends. Meet their friends. Ask them about their friends. You know, get to know who the influencers are in their life. The next way to let them know that you know them, applaud their wins. When you see them doing something really well, celebrate that with them. Let them know. See and applaud their wins. Encourage them in their defeats. We all need encouragement because we all fail. It's just part of our daily lives. And so encourage them in their defeats. And the next thing is you want to believe in them when they're at their worst. The people in your lives, they're going to see you at your worst, inevitably. You're going to have a bad day. Even if it's just a bad day in a year, if you're really, really awesome. I have probably one bad day a week easily. So you want to believe in them at their worst because you know how influential the people who love you and they believe in you at your worst, you would do almost anything for them because acceptance is such a powerful thing. And so these are ways to let people know that you know them. Now, just in summary, this is an illustration here on your screen about what's happening with 3-story evangelism. The closer you get to Jesus, your story and his story, that is going to give you a love to get close to the people God has put in your life, and their story and your story are going to get closer. This happens by getting to know their story and listening to them. You're going to get closer. In this next video, we're going to talk about how to transition from getting to know their story to you sharing your story with them.